Good afternoon. It's Friday. We made it. We made it through another week, and we are about 6 weeks left of virtual school, so we can do it. All right, yesterday we had last read about the Wendigo. That was the last chapter we read. Amy Ann had gone to a bookstore with her family and was going to pick up a couple of those books that were banned on the list from the library. She bought the Egypt game and the scary stories to tell in the dark. She said she really liked the Egypt game, but then she started to read scary stories to tell in the dark, but wasn't able to get through it because they were too scary for her. So that is where we're at right now. The next chapter was called Our Own Little Book Club, and I had kind of given you guys a question to think about what's going to happen next and what kind of book club do you think they're going to have? What books do you think they're going to be reading in there? Why would they just now be starting a book club? So that's what we're going to find out today. Danny Purcell brought Wait Till Helen Comes on Monday, and I read it that night. It was awesome. It was scary, but not scary stories to tell in the dark scary. The little girl in it, the one with the funny haircut on the cover, is so creepy. She hates her new stepbrother and stepsister, and she tells them a ghost she met in the graveyard is going to come after them and punish them for being mean to her. When Rebecca finished from the mixed up files, which she liked, mostly I think because Mrs. Frankweiler is all the time talking to her lawyer, she read Danny's copy of Wait Till Helen Comes while Danny read from the mixed up files. It's like we had our own little book club. Rebecca caught me at my locker at the end of lunch one day. Amy Ann, I looked all over for you in the cafeteria. Where were you? I got a pass to go to the library instead, I told her. Even though my favorite book still wasn't on the shelf, there were lots of other library books I wanted to read. Oh, I see how it is, Rebecca said, pretending to be angry. You love books more than your best friend. Well, I don't need you. I've got Helen. She's my only real friend, even though nobody else can see her. You just wait till Helen comes. Then you'll be sorry. We cracked up laughing together. Danny loped over to us, brushed his hair out of his eyes. Hey, what's so funny? We could barely answer him. We were laughing so hard. Just wait till Helen comes, I said, trying to sound spooky. Then you'll be sorry. Is that from that book? Danny said. No fair joking about it before I've read it. I only just finished Basil E. Frankweiler, and I want to read that Scary Stories book next. I froze and shook my head, my eyes wide. I hid it, I told him. Why? Danny said, is it really scary? I let out a little squeak. Danny pulled my locker door open wide. Where is it? I want to read it. The book wasn't in my locker. It wasn't under my mattress anymore either. I hadn't been able to sleep knowing it was there. Right at that moment, it was hidden in an old gym bag at the back of my closet, buried under a pile of clothes. I grabbed my locker door to close it and explain why Scary Stories wasn't there, and that's when I saw it. There was a note in my locker mailbox. Why is this a big deal? Why did she stop and freeze and was like, there's a note in my locker mailbox? If you remember from the beginning of the book, she's never gotten a note. She's kind of a quiet girl, shy. Nobody really wrote her notes to put in her locker mailbox, but now she has one. A notable note. I didn't notice right off because I had gotten used to not getting any notes, but something white and folded was definitely sticking up out of my locker mailbox. I must have stood and stared at it for a long time because Rebecca had to wave her hand in front of my face to get my attention. Hey, Earth to Amy Ann, you look like you just saw Helen's ghost. I pointed the note. Did you send me a note? Rebecca shook her head. Never leave a paper trail, she reminded me. Then a horrible thought struck her and she turned on Danny. You didn't send her a note, did you? Danny took a step back. Hey, whoa, send a note to a girl? No way. Rebecca relaxed. If Danny had written me a note, I didn't know which of us she would have killed first. Who else would send me a note? I asked. Well, I know a good way to find out, Danny said. You could, read it and find out. I pulled out the note and unfolded it. It was a piece of notebook paper torn out of a spiral notebook with pink loopy handwriting on it. AA. Danny said you have the Egypt game. Can I read it? Jana. It's from Jana Park, I said. She wants to borrow the Egypt game. Oh yeah, I told her you had a copy, Danny said. My heart skipped a beat. Jana Park had written me a note. Jana Park had written me a note and called me AA. No one had ever called me AA before. I liked it. Jana was one of the girls who was always following Danny around, like Rebecca. Jana probably liked Danny's hair as much as he did. I was surprised he'd even mentioned the Egypt game to her, since he'd only heard me talking to Rebecca about it on the bus. But I was excited that someone else wanted to read it. Good books shouldn't be hidden anyway. They should be read by as many people as many times as possible. I wrote a note back to Jana and stuck it in her locker before going back to class. Jana, sure, I'll bring it tomorrow. AA. Jana came to my locker the next day after lunch. I passed her the Egypt game in secret, like we were in a spy movie. Thanks, she said. Then she stood there and didn't leave. You're welcome, I said. She still didn't leave. What is it? I asked her. Jana looked around, then said quietly, do you have any of the other books? You know, if I wanted to read any of them? Oh yeah, I said. I've got From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, but it is really, really scary. And Danny's got Wait Till Helen Comes, but he probably already told you that. Oh, Jana said. Is that all? She looked in my locker as though the other books might be in there. She was disappointed. I could tell, and suddenly, the only thing I wanted in the world was to please her, because she had written me a note and called me AA. Those are the only ones I have now, I told her. But if there's another one you want to read, I can probably get it. I'm saving up. I ran through the titles in my head. Is it Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret? She shook her head, and I felt a little relieved. I was still a little afraid of that one. Is it Harriet the Spy? She shook her head. Goosebumps? No. Junie B? No. Matilda? No. What else could it be? It couldn't be Captain Underpants. That only left Oh. She wanted to read that one. Rebecca popped up beside us, and Jana and I jumped. Okay, thanks, bye, Jana said, and she hurried away. What was all that about? Rebecca asked. Jana borrowed the Egypt game from me, but I think she wants to read a different one of the banned books instead. Which one? I whispered. It's perfectly normal. I grabbed a braid and held it close to my mouth. But I can't buy that one. That was on the list, Rebecca said. You don't have to buy that one. I've got it. My eyes went wide. She had a copy? At your house? I asked. Yeah, she said. She acted like it was no big thing. My mom gave it to me. I think that way I couldn't sue her for one day not telling me everything before I needed to know it. Have you read it? I whispered. Rebecca leaned in breathlessly. Some parts. I wanted to ask her which parts and what it said, but I was too embarrassed. I jumped as Mr. Vaughn called us into class down the hall. Will you bring it? I asked her as we ran to class. Rebecca stopped at the door. Okay, she said with a secret smile, and she threw open the door and ran inside. With Rebecca's book and Danny's book and my books, I could have almost half the books Mrs. Spencer banned from the library sitting in my locker by tomorrow, where anybody could read them, not just me, which is when I got an even bigger idea than the one I had before. What do you think her bigger idea is? She started like a small book club. There's other people that are wanting to buy the books. What do you think the bigger idea is? Well, we're just gonna read it to find out. I cleared out the shelf in my locker. On it, I put my copies of From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Shiver. Danny's copy of Wait Till Helen Comes and Rebecca's copy of It's Perfectly Normal, which I had only peeked at. Jana let me have a couple of old Junie B. Jones books she had at home, and Danny got his friend Parker to donate his whole collection of Goosebumps books. When Jana gave me back the Egypt game, I would have a total of 14 books. 14 books banned by Mrs. Spencer and her friends, free to borrow for any student who wanted to read them. And that's how the banned books locker library began. I still had 4 books to go to have all the banned books. Well, more than that if you count all the other Goosebumps and Junie B books and Captain Underpants books. But all I really still needed was Harriet the Spy. Matilda? Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, and a Captain Underpants book. Then I'd have at least one of everything on Mrs. Spencer's list. But Mrs. Spencer wasn't done. When I went to the school library after school to hide out in my usual spot until the late bus came, Mrs. Spencer was there. Today, she was wearing one of those pink matching tracksuits that nobody really goes running in. And she had another list of books. More? Mrs. Jones said. Her face turned the same color as her orange and white polka dot dress. Honestly, Mrs. Spencer, have you read all these books? Have you read any of them? I pretended to be interested in the magazine rack near the front desk so I could listen. I don't need to read them, Mrs. Spencer said. Once I took my concerns to the school board, a number of other parents brought other books to my attention. I looked up reviews of the books online and decided these books weren't appropriate for an elementary school library. You decided, Mrs. Jones said. I didn't realize you had a library and information science degree. Mrs. Spencer stood straighter. It had added an inch to her height, but still not enough to come up to Mrs. Jones' level. I don't need a fancy library degree to know what's right and what's wrong for children. I see, Mrs. Jones said. Let me just get you some requests for reconsideration forms in. That won't be necessary, Mrs. Spencer said. I've already spoken to members of the school board about these books, and they agree that they have no place at Shelburne Elementary. Well, Mrs. Jones said, be that as it may, until I hear from the school board, these books will stay on the shelf. She handed the list back to Mrs. Spencer. I see, Mrs. Spencer said. She looked at the list for a moment, then smiled sweetly. You know, before I go, I think I'll pick out some books to check out. For Trey. Mrs. Jones smiled back. Anything I can do to help? No thanks, Mrs. Spencer said. She held up the piece of paper with the new book she wanted to ban written on it. I have a list. I knew what Mrs. Spencer was doing. So did Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Spencer was going to check out all the books on her new list so no one else could check them out until the school board told Mrs. Jones to take them off the shelf, and there was nothing Mrs. Jones could do about it. For the next 15 minutes, Mrs. Spencer went through the shelves and collected every single book on her list. I couldn't watch, but I also couldn't hide out in my favorite spot. Trey was sitting in it, drawing in his notebook. I pulled up short, as shocked as I had been when Mrs. Frankweiler had gone missing. I felt the heat rise in my face. First, Trey's mom had banned my favorite book from the library, and now Trey was sitting in my library seat, and I still hadn't forgiven him for what he did to me in 3rd grade. My fist clenched at the hem of my skirt, but I slipped away down a row of books before he could look up and see me. Mrs. Spencer finally came up to the counter with a huge armful of books, and Mrs. Jones had no choice but to check them out to her in Trey's name. Trey, it's time to go, Mrs. Spencer said. He collected his stuff and left my spot at last. On the way out, he glanced up and saw me watching him from behind a big potted plant. I stuck my tongue out at him, but he just chuckled. That odious woman, Mrs. Jones said when they had gone. This all started when she didn't like the Captain Underpants book Trey checked out. She gave me an exasperated sigh, but then she seemed to get an idea. She smiled to herself and went into the office in the back, the one with all the windows, and got on the computer. While Mrs. Jones wasn't looking, I snatched the list Mrs. Spencer had left on the counter, and dashed out of the library. I needed it. Every time Mrs. Spencer took a book from the school library, I was going to add a book to my secret locker library. And that's where we're stopping today. Alright, what'd you think? What were your thoughts? Kind of seems like Amy Ann's like being sneaky, like not great sneaky. Like she's disobeying rules and she's sharing books with all of these friends, but I don't know. I guess we'll have to find out. So 2 things I want you to write about. 1, what do you think is going to happen with all of the books that Amy Ann is adding to her secret locker library? And 2, how do you think Trey feels? How do you think Trey feels that his mom is taking out all of the books from the library? Not all of them, but a lot of the books from the library. And clearly there's someone that it's upsetting. If this wasn't upsetting anybody, I'm sure he could just, like, you know, hide out in the corner and not be noticed and not be affected by it. But Amy Ann's upset, and now she's got her friends wanting to read those books too. So how do you think Trey is feeling with all of this? And what do you think is going to happen with all of the books that Amy Ann is adding to her secret locker library? All right, see you guys on Monday. Enjoy your weekend. Stay safe, stay clean, and that's it. We can do this. Bye.